There's a building in Queens, New York, where college students show up every morning at some backpacks on coffee in hand, completely unaware that they're walking into what was once the largest bakery on the entire planet. Not the largest in New York, not the largest in America, the largest on Earth. For over 50 years, this 9-story fortress of white glazed brick pumped the smell of fresh-baked cookies across the East River, while thousands of workers produced products that sat on virtually every kitchen shelf in America. Hydrox cookies, Cheez-It crackers, animal crackers, crispy saltines. You've eaten their products. You just don't know their name anymore, because Sunshine Biscuits didn't collapse from a scandal. There was no fraud, no fire, no single moment you could point to and say, that's where it all went wrong. They were simply sold, then sold again, then picked apart, brand by brand, until a company worth hundreds of millions became nothing more than a line item on someone else's spreadsheet. And the cookie they invented, Hydrox, came out 4 full years before Oreo ever existed. 4 years. Yet today, most Americans think Hydrox was the knockoff. That's not just irony. That's a warning. This is the story of how 3 men walked away from the most powerful food empire in American history to build something extraordinary. And how the city that made them giants became the first thing they had to leave behind. Chapter 1. The Kid Who Quit School at 16. Jacob Leander Luce was born on June 17, 1850, in Greencastle, Indiana, a small farm town where the biggest ambition most kids had was inheriting the land their fathers already worked. He grew up in a large household, one of 10 children raised by a farmer named Isaac Luce and his wife Eliza. Nothing about his childhood suggested he would one day control a food empire that fed millions of Americans. Nothing, except maybe the fact that at 16 years old, he looked at the life laid out in front of him. Farm work, small town, small future, and quietly decided it wasn't enough. He left school, moved to Decatur, Illinois, and got himself a job as a store clerk earning $5 a week. $5. That was the starting point of the man who would eventually walk away from Nabisco. At 20, he moved again, heading west to Chettapa, Kansas, where he opened a dry goods store alongside his younger brother Joseph. No business degree, no investors. Just 2 brothers betting on themselves in a frontier town, barely a dot on the map. It was here Jacob learned something most formally educated people never fully absorb. You understand a market not by studying it, but by serving it. Every customer who walked through that door taught him something about what people needed, what they'd pay for, and what kept them coming back. By the time he left Kansas, he had built something more valuable than capital. He had instincts. In 1878, he married Ella Ann Clark in Carthage, Missouri. They had 2 children together. Both died in infancy. That kind of grief doesn't leave a person. It reshapes them. Jacob and Ella channeled that loss outward, becoming 2 of the most dedicated philanthropists Kansas City had ever seen, quietly pouring money into orphanages, hospitals, and children's charities for the rest of their lives. In 1882, the couple relocated to Kansas City, and Jacob made his move into the biscuit business, buying a controlling interest in a small operation called Coral Cracker and Confectionery Company, folding Joseph into the deal, and renaming it Luce Brothers Manufacturing Company. What followed over the next decade was relentless. Jacob organized 17 regional bakeries across the country into a single alliance called the American Biscuit Company, and he ran it. By the late 1890s, he was one of the most powerful figures in American food manufacturing. Then, in 1898, a consolidation wave swept through the industry. The American Biscuit Company was absorbed into a massive new conglomerate, 114 factories combining into the National Biscuit Company. Nabisco. Jacob and Joseph both landed seats on the board. It should have been the finish line, the reward for 2 decades of grinding. Instead, it became the cage. In 1897, before the merger finalized, Jacob fell seriously ill and spent months recovering in Europe. When he returned, he looked at what Nabisco was becoming, a monopoly controlling roughly 90% of the American cracker market, strangling competition, dictating terms to every distributor in the country, growing so large that the men who actually built the industry had become invisible inside it. Jacob Loos had spent his entire adult life building things from nothing. He had no interest in being managed by a machine he no longer recognized. So in 1902, at 52 years old, an age when most men of his era were thinking about slowing down, he and Joseph, along with business partner John H. Wiles, cashed out their Nabisco shares entirely and walked away. They called their new company Loos Wiles Biscuit Company. No safety net, no guarantee. Just 3 men who believed that what they could build together was worth more than the comfort of staying inside an empire that someone else controlled. Chapter 2. Where Sunlight Became a Brand. When Jacob Loos and his partners walked away from Nabisco in 1902, the first thing they had to figure out wasn't what to bake. It was where to bake it, and what that place was going to say about them. Because in 1902, American food manufacturing had a reputation problem, a serious one. This was an era before the FDA existed, before federal food safety laws had any real teeth. Adulterating food was common practice. Flour got cut with plaster of Paris to add weight. Chalk, clay. And in some documented cases, arsenic-based compounds were found in processed foods. The average consumer had no way of knowing what was actually inside the product they were buying, because most of it came in unmarked barrels, weighed out by the scoop at the grocery counter. There were no labels, no ingredients list, no accountability. Jacob Loos had spent 20 years in this industry. He knew exactly what was going on behind closed doors in factories with no windows, no light, and no one watching. And he decided his factory was going to be the opposite of all of that. The Kansas City plant, built in the West Bottoms district, directly connected to the city's railroad network for Midwest distribution, was designed from the ground up around one idea: flood the building with natural light. Large windows on every floor, open, ventilated spaces. The logic wasn't just philosophical, it was practical. Natural light discourages mold growth and reduces the kinds of damp, dark conditions where pest infestations thrive. In a bakery handling flour, sugar, and fat every single day, that matters. But beyond the science, there was a more powerful message being sent. A factory full of windows is a factory that isn't hiding anything. You could look in. You were supposed to look in. That transparency was the product just as much as the cookies themselves. They named the brand Sunshine. One word, no explanation needed. The name carried the entire philosophy inside it. Light, cleanliness, warmth, quality. It was one of the smartest pieces of brand positioning in early American food history, and it cost them nothing but the decision to make it. There's also a more personal story behind the name. According to the Loos family's own records, Sunshine was Jacob's private nickname for his wife Ella, the same woman who had grieved 2 children with him. The same woman who would later donate 80 acres of land to Kansas City to create what is now Loos Park. He even had the letter S carved into the mahogany staircase of the mansion he built for her in 1911. Whether the name came from the factory design, from Ella, or from both at once, it doesn't really matter. What matters is that it stuck. Here's what didn't stick, though, and this is the part that should make any entrepreneur wince. Loos Wiles never formally registered the name Sunshine as a trademark. Not in 1902, not in 1910, not for 4 full decades. Because they had no registered mark, They had no automatic legal protection every time a competitor slapped the word Sunshine on a package. And many did. Loose Wiles had to launch their own investigation to determine which company had used the word first, in which market, going back how many years, just to establish prior claim. It was an endless, expensive, exhausting legal battle that consumed company resources for 40 years. Resources that could have gone into product development, marketing, or fighting Nabisco. They were the ones who built the Sunshine name into something worth stealing. And they gave everyone else a free shot at it because of one clerical oversight at the very beginning. It wasn't until 1946, 44 years after founding, that they officially changed the company name to Sunshine Biscuit Incorporated and locked it down properly. The Kansas City factory itself ran continuously from 1902 until 1958, 56 years of production. The building that started it all outlasted the men who built it. But by then, the real story had already moved to New York. Chapter 3. The Thousand-Window Bakery. By the early 1900s, Loose Wiles had already proven they could compete. Kansas City was running. Boston was running. But if you wanted to be taken seriously as a national brand in America, there was really only one city that mattered: New York. Not just because of its population, though feeding 5 million people was a business opportunity unlike anything else in the country at the time. New York mattered because of its infrastructure, its ports, its rail connections, its position as the commercial center of the entire eastern seaboard. If you could ship out of New York, you could reach the world. Loose Wiles knew that. And in 1909, they made their move. They chose Long Island City, Queens, a neighborhood that most people today associate with trendy apartments and coffee shops. But in the early 20th century was something else entirely. It was one of the most ambitious industrial experiments in American history. A developer named Michael J. Degnan had looked at 125 acres of swampy, largely useless wetlands along Dutch Kills Creek and decided he was going to build the nation's largest manufacturing district on top of it. He dredged the waterways filled in the marshland, built streets from scratch, and then constructed an internal railroad system, the Denon Terminal Railway, that ran tracks directly into every single factory on the property. Freight cars could pull up to a loading dock, get filled or emptied, and roll straight onto connections with the Long Island Railroad's Sunnyside yards less than a mile away. From there, product could move to Manhattan, Brooklyn, or north into New England via the Hell Gate Bridge. Degnan didn't build a factory. He built a machine for moving goods at scale, and then invited the biggest companies in America to plug into it. Loose Wiles was the first major industrial structure to go up in the Degnan terminal, and what they built was not a building anyone was going to forget. The architect was William Higginson, and what he designed was a 9-story wedge-shaped structure. Its angular footprint dictated by the irregular intersection of streets at that particular corner of Queens. The exterior was clad entirely in white glazed brick produced by the Atlantic Terracotta Company. Bright, reflective Owen, almost luminous on a clear day. And covering that white surface on every floor, on every face of the building, were windows, hundreds of them, enormous for a factory of that era, running nearly wall to wall across every level. When the building opened, people started calling it the Thousand-Window Bakery, and the name stuck immediately because it was accurate. Standing across the street and looking up, the glass seemed to go on forever. Inside the structure was reinforced concrete framing, a relatively modern construction technique at the time, chosen specifically because it allowed open floor plans without the interior columns that wood frame buildings required. That meant long, unobstructed production lines, room to move, room to scale. A dedicated 2-story garage on the property housed the entire fleet of delivery trucks. Rail cars ran directly into the rear of the building for loading and unloading raw materials. The logistics were completely self-contained, which in 1909 was extraordinarily forward-thinking. Their neighbors in the Daignan terminal read like a directory of American industrial power. The American Chicle Company was right there, makers of chiclets and dentine gum, Eveready batteries, warehouses for both Macy's and Gimbel's department stores. The Ford Motor Company had a plant nearby. Packard and Studebaker were there, Burke's Ale Brewery, and Guinness Beer had a brewery operation in the complex as well. The thousand-window bakery wasn't just a factory. It was planted at the center of the industrial universe, surrounded by the brands that defined everyday American life. And for the next 4 decades, it held a title that no other bakery on earth could claim. From 1912 until 1955, it was the largest bakery building in the entire world. Chapter 4. The Cookies That Built an Empire. By the time Loose Wiles had their Long Island City factory humming in 1912, they weren't just a company anymore. They were a machine. And like any machine worth running, what they needed now was something worth producing. Something that people would actually reach for on a shelf, fight over at the breakfast table, remember for the rest of their lives. They already had crispy saltines, animal crackers, graham crackers. Solid products. Reliable sellers. But solid and reliable don't build legends. What built this legend was a cookie that came out 4 years before the most famous cookie in American history, and still somehow lost the war. In 1908, Sunshine introduced Hydrox, a chocolate wafer sandwich with a cream center. 2 dark, crisp shells pressed around a white filling. Sound familiar? It should. Because Oreo, the cookie that most of the world considers the original, didn't exist yet. Oreo wouldn't show up until April 2nd, 1912, when Nabisco introduced it as one of 3 new products, the other 2 of which nobody remembers. Hydrox was first, Hydrox was the blueprint, and Hydrox had a name that, in theory, made complete sense. The word combined hydrogen and oxygen, the 2 elements that form water, chosen deliberately to signal purity at a time when American food still had a serious contamination problem. Chalk in flour, plaster in bread, arsenic compounds in processed goods. Naming a cookie after the chemistry of clean water was a statement, not an accident. Sunshine even ran ads boasting that their chemists tested every batch for purity. Produced in those famous thousand-window factories where light flooded every floor, it was scientific marketing, rational marketing. And it was absolutely the wrong name for a cookie. Because hydrogen plus oxygen to the average American ear doesn't say clean, it says hydrogen peroxide. It says chemicals. It says the brown bottle under your bathroom sink. There was even an actual Hydrox chemical company selling hydrogen peroxide at the time, caught up in trademark disputes over the word. So while Oreo was a short, punchy 2-syllable word that meant nothing and stuck everywhere, Hydrox was a mouthful that made people think of disinfectant. Nabisco had better marketing, a larger distribution network, and a name that a 5-year-old could say without frowning. Hydrox had history and a harder cookie shell, one that was less sweet, crunchier, and didn't go soggy in milk. Food writer Calvin Trillin once called it the far superior cookie. It didn't matter. By the time Keebler took over Sunshine in 1996, Oreo was doing $374 million in annual sales. Hydrox was at $16 million. The original had become the afterthought. But Hydrox wasn't the only thing Sunshine built. In 1921, a small cracker company called Green and Green out of Dayton, Ohio, founded by Weston Green in 1907, introduced a product they called a baked rarebit. The name was a nod to Welsh rarebit, a dish of melted cheese on toast. The cracker was small, square, orange, made with 100% real cheese, and had a single hole punched through the center. That hole wasn't decorative. It was functional. During baking, steam needs somewhere to escape. Without the hole, pressure builds unevenly inside the dough, and the cracker puffs, buckles, or cracks before it sets. The hole lets steam release uniformly across the entire surface, which is what gives each cracker consistent structure and that signature crunch. Green & Green trademarked the name Cheez-It on May 23, 1921. It was a genuinely clever piece of food engineering wrapped in a genuinely terrible spelling, and it worked perfectly. Loose Wiles recognized what they had when they acquired the Green & Green Company in the early 1930s. And from that point on, Sunshine's distribution network pushed Cheez-It from a regional Ohio snack into every corner of the country. That acquisition turned out to be the single best business decision Sunshine ever made, because long after Hydrox was dead and buried, long after the 1,000-window bakery had been sold and converted into classrooms, Cheez-It was still on every shelf in America, generating over $125 million a year by 1996 and hundreds of millions more after that. The empire fell. The cracker survived. Chapter 5. When Sunshine owned America, there's a moment in the life of every great company where everything clicks. The product is right. The timing is right. The country is ready. For Sunshine Biscuits, that moment stretched across 3 decades, from the 1920s through the early 1950s. And during that window, they weren't just competing with the biggest names in American food. They were one of them. After Jacob Luce died in 1923, the company he built didn't slow down. It expanded. Through the 20s and into the Depression years, Sunshine pushed its manufacturing network beyond its Midwest and Northeast roots, adding plants in California, Georgia, and New Jersey, threading their products into every corner of the country. This wasn't just geographic growth. It was a fundamental transformation. Loose Wiles had started as a regional challenger, a scrappy alternative to the Nabisco machine. By the 1930s, Sunshine Biscuit was something else entirely. A national brand. The kind whose products people expected to find, whether they were shopping in Manhattan or rural Georgia. The Wall Street Journal had already recognized what they were doing as far back as 1912, describing Sunshine as a textbook example of successful competition against what the paper called an alleged trust, meaning they were publicly holding off Nabisco at a time when most of the industry had surrendered to it. That reputation stuck. It became part of the brand's identity. Sunshine wasn't just a cookie company. They were the ones who fought back. The Long Island City factory was the engine at the center of all of it. By the 1930s and 40s, the 1,000-window bakery was operating around the clock, multiple shifts, thousands of workers moving through those floors every single day. Automated production lines, modern for their era, ran continuously, turning out hundreds of millions of units annually, and shipping them out through the Degnon terminal rail connections directly into the distribution arteries of the entire eastern seaboard. From Queens, Sunshine products could reach Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Washington within a day. The logistics infrastructure they had locked into when they chose Long Island City in 1909 was now paying off at a scale they could barely have imagined when they broke ground. Then came the war. When the United States entered World War II in December 1941, the federal government needed to feed millions of soldiers, and it needed to do it fast. The military's K ration, a compact portable daily food supply designed to sustain combat soldiers in the field, included crackers as a core component. Sunshine was among the manufacturers tapped to produce K-ration biscuits at scale. Their crackers, stamped with the company name on the cellophane packaging, shipped out to American troops across Europe and the Pacific. A Saginaw News report from 1961 recalled that during World War II, Sunshine products were a standard item in military ration kits, and that the company had stood ready to serve the nation with increased personnel and a production system that could be converted to military supply almost instantly. That wartime relationship between a food company and the federal government wasn't just a patriotic footnote. It was a massive business opportunity. The contracts were enormous, the volumes were extraordinary, and the brand exposure that came from having your crackers in the hands of 12 million American servicemen was the kind of advertising money couldn't buy. When the soldiers came home, they came home with brand loyalty already built. The men who had eaten Sunshine crackers in foxholes in France and jungles in the Pacific were now setting up households in the suburbs, going grocery shopping with their wives, and reaching for what they knew. The post-war American consumer boom of the late 1940s and 1950s was the single greatest expansion of grocery spending in the country's history. And Sunshine was perfectly positioned inside it. By the mid-1950s, they had cemented their position as the third largest cookie and cracker company in the United States, trailing only Nabisco and a handful of others, with annual revenues running into the hundreds of millions of dollars. It was also during this period, 1946 specifically, that the company finally did something they should have done 40 years earlier. They officially changed the corporate name from Loose Wiles Biscuit Company to Sunshine Biscuit Incorporated and properly registered the trademark that had been the face of every product they made since 1902. 44 years of operating under a name they didn't legally own, fighting off imitators case by case, dollar by dollar. Now it was locked down. Now it was theirs. The timing was almost bittersweet. By 1946, the name was worth protecting more than ever. But the decades of legal exposure had already cost them more than anyone publicly acknowledged. And through all of it, the Depression, the war, the post-war boom, the 1,000-window bakery in Long Island City stood at the center. From 1912 to 1955, it held its title without interruption, the largest bakery building in the world, 43 years. When you picture Sunshine at its peak, that building is what peak looks like. White glazed brick catching the morning light off the East River, hundreds of windows glowing from inside. The smell of cookies drifting over Queens every day, as reliable as the sunrise. That was the golden age. And like all golden ages, nobody inside it knew it was ending. Chapter 6. How the original became the underdog. Here's the thing about competing against a giant. It's not one punch that takes you down. It's 1,000 small ones over decades. In places you don't even notice until the damage is already done. Sunshine Biscuits didn't lose to Nabisco in a single moment. They lost slowly, quarter by quarter, shelf by shelf. And the story of how it happened is one of the most instructive business cautionary tales in American food history. Let's start with the numbers, because the numbers tell the truth. In the early 1900s, Sunshine's annual sales were roughly $11.7 million against Nabisco's $45 million. Dori alsamsam, about 25 cents on every dollar Nabisco made. That gap was real, but it was manageable. Sunshine was growing. They were competing. By the early 1960s, Sunshine had climbed to $207.9 million in annual revenue. And Nabisco was sitting at approximately $500 million. Still a gap, but Sunshine had gotten to nearly 40 cents on every dollar. That was as close as they would ever get, and from that point forward, the distance between the two companies didn't shrink, it grew. Understanding why requires looking at three different forces that were all working against Sunshine at the same time, none of which were their fault, and all of which they were too slow to respond to. The first was structural. In the 1930s, a period of intense antitrust scrutiny was sweeping through American industries. Congress passed the Robinson-Patman Act in 1936, specifically targeting a practice that had become widespread in retail and grocery. Large companies using their volume and leverage to secure pricing arrangements from distributors and wholesalers that smaller competitors simply could not match. Nabisco, with its dominant market share and enormous purchasing power, was precisely the kind of company the act was aimed at. The principle was straightforward. If a supplier charges one buyer a lower price than another for the same goods in comparable quantities, with the intent of reducing competition, that's a violation. Nabisco had been accused of using exactly these kinds of preferential discount structures to pressure wholesalers into prioritizing their products over competitors, like Sunshine. Between the 1930s and 1970s, enforcement of the Robinson-Patman Act created real constraints on how aggressively the biggest players could tilt the playing field, but enforcement was imperfect, slow, and difficult to prove. The damage to Sunshine's distribution channels happened in the margins, quietly, over years. The second force was television. When American television advertising exploded in the 1950s, Nabisco had the budget to be everywhere. Oreo ran campaigns aimed squarely at children, the generation that would grow up reaching for Oreos automatically, without a second thought, because those were the cookies they'd watched on TV their whole lives. Sunshine, when they advertised at all, continued marketing Hydrox to adults on the basis of taste and quality. They touted the crunchier shell, the less sweet filling, the fact that Hydrox had been kosher since day one while Oreo used lard until the 1990s. All of that was true. None of it resonated with a 7-year-old watching Saturday morning cartoons. Nabisco also built their identity around a ritual, Twist Lick Dunk, a physical, interactive experience with the cookie that had nothing to do with ingredients and everything to do with memory and emotion. By the time Oreo ran its mid-1950s redesign and aggressive new ad campaigns, it wasn't just outselling Hydrox, it was outculturing it. The third force was the one nobody could have anticipated: perception drift. Somewhere in the late 1950s and into the 1960s, a reversal happened in the public mind. Oreo. The cookie that had been introduced 4 years after Hydrox, widely considered at the time to be a direct imitation, had become so dominant that consumers started assuming it was the original, Hydrox. The product that had existed first began to be perceived as a knockoff, a cheap substitute, the off-brand option. The New York Times even described Hydrox as the Pepsi to the Oreo's Coca-Cola, which was generous because at least Pepsi was still in the race. Once that perception set in, it became nearly impossible to reverse. No amount of historical fact corrects a consumer habit that's been building for a decade. By 1965, the math had become undeniable inside Sunshine's boardroom. The Long Island City factory, the 1,000-window bakery, the largest bakery in the world for 43 consecutive years, was shut down. Production shifted to Sayreville, New Jersey, the building that had defined the company's ambition. Its scale, its identity as a New York institution, was locked up and left behind. 7 years earlier, in 1958, the original Kansas City plant had already gone dark. Both founding locations, the two buildings that had given Sunshine its name and its story, were gone within a single decade. The empire was still standing, but it had quietly, without any announcement, begun the process of letting go. Chapter 7. How a cookie company got swallowed whole. There's a particular kind of corporate death that doesn't look like death from the outside. The lights are still on. The factories are still running. The products are still on the shelves. But somewhere inside the organization, the people who built it are gone. The decisions are being made by strangers, and the name on the building means less every year than it did the year before. That's what happened to Sunshine Biscuits. Not a collapse, a disappearance, slow, methodical, and almost entirely invisible to the American consumer who was still buying their crackers every week without thinking twice about who actually owned them anymore. It started in 1966, 1 year after the Long Island City factory closed. Sunshine Biscuits, still the third largest cookie and cracker company in the United States at the time, still generating hundreds of millions in annual revenue, was sold to the American Tobacco Company. Let that sink in for a second. A tobacco company bought a cookie company, not because they knew anything about baking, not because they had a vision for where Sunshine could go. They bought it because they were scared. By the mid-1960s, the U.S. Surgeon General had just released his landmark report linking cigarettes to lung cancer. And the tobacco industry could see the regulatory and legal walls closing in. American Tobacco, makers of Lucky Strike and Pall Mall, one of the most dominant cigarette brands in the country for decades, was sitting on enormous cash flow from its tobacco operations and desperately needed somewhere to park that money that wasn't a cigarette. So they went shopping. They bought Jim Beam whiskey. They bought Moen faucets. They bought Master Lock. They bought Sunshine Biscuits. By 1969, they had renamed the entire operation American Brands, incorporated symbolically scrubbing the word tobacco from their identity. A cookie company that had been built on the philosophy of clean, transparent manufacturing was now a line item in a diversified conglomerate whose core business had spent 15 years lying to the public about cancer. The irony is almost too heavy to carry. Under American Brands, Sunshine continued to operate, but it was no longer the priority. It was a cash flow asset inside a portfolio that stretched from whiskey to golf equipment. The brand had no champion at the top. No one in the boardroom who cared about what Hydrox represented or what the Thousand Window Bakery had meant. For over 20 years, Sunshine sat inside American Brands, producing, distributing, surviving, but drifting further and further from the identity that Jacob Luce had spent his life building. Then, on April 18, 1988, American Brands sold Sunshine to GF Industries, Incorporated, a privately held conglomerate based in Oakland, California, with interests across multiple unrelated sectors. Headquarters moved to Woodbridge, New Jersey. The company that had been born in Kansas City had found its soul in Long Island City and had fed the East Coast for half a century, was now being run out of a suburban New Jersey office park by people whose other businesses had nothing to do with baking. By 1996, something remarkable was still true. Despite everything, Sunshine Biscuits was still the third largest cookie and cracker company in America. Annual revenues were running at approximately $500 million. Cheez-It alone was generating around $125 million of that every single year, a number that was growing. Vienna Fingers was bringing in $50 million annually. The brand still had genuine market power, and that made it a target. In 1996, the Keebler Company acquired Sunshine Biscuits. Keebler was a formidable operation, founded in Philadelphia in 1853, nationally known for their Keebler Elves advertising campaign, and hungry to grow their share of the snack market. The acquisition gave Keebler products in one of every 4 cookie or cracker purchases made in America. On paper, it looked like a rescue. In practice, for most of Sunshine's product line, it was an execution. The integration was swift and unsentimental. Keebler's CEO had made clear from the beginning that the priority was Cheez-It and a handful of other high-volume sellers. Everything else would be evaluated on pure commercial logic. And pure commercial logic has no room for nostalgia. Within months of the acquisition closing, the verdict on most of Sunshine's legacy brands came back the same way. Discontinued. Chipperoos gone. Chocolate nugget cookies gone. Lemon coolers gone. Golden raisin biscuits gone. Golden fruit biscuits gone. Hi-ho crackers. The buttery round cracker that had been on American tables since around 1930, 60-plus years on the market. Gone. Unable to compete with Nabisco's Ritz, which had outsold it for decades. These weren't minor products. They were names that entire generations of American families had grown up with. They vanished from store shelves within months, replaced by nothing, mourned quietly by the people who remembered them. Vienna Fingers was kept alive, but stripped of the Sunshine name and relabeled as a Keebler product. The name Sunshine, which Jacob Luce had embedded into American culture starting in 1902, was now attached to exactly two products, Cheez-It and Crispy Saltines. Then in March 2001, Kellogg's acquired Keebler for $4.56 billion. Sunshine, what remained of it, was now inside one of the largest food conglomerates on Earth, not a subsidiary of a subsidiary, but a brand within a brand within a brand 3 levels deep inside a corporate structure that had cereal Pop-Tarts and Eggo waffles to worry about. The independent company that 3 men had walked away from Nabisco to build in 1902 had, in the end, been consumed by something even larger than Nabisco ever was. Chapter 8: The Death of Hydrox. There's a moment in this story that I keep coming back to. A quote from a Keebler spokeswoman. Sometime around 1999, when she was asked why the company wasn't marketing Hydrox as the original chocolate sandwich cookie. Her answer was this: according to our research, not only is that claim not meaningful to consumers, it's not even credible. People don't believe it. They think Hydrox are the knockoff of Oreos, not the other way around. Read that again. A cookie that had existed for 91 years, a product that Nabisco's own Oreo had directly imitated in 1912. And by 1999, the people who owned it couldn't even use its own history as a selling point, because no one believed the history was real. That is the complete story of what happened to Hydrox, compressed into 2 sentences, and the rest of it is just the slow, painful details. Let's go back to where it started to fall apart. Hydrox had always competed at a disadvantage when it came to advertising. Sunshine's budgets were real, but they were never Nabisco level. And by the 1960s and 70s, the gap in television spending was enormous. Oreo was everywhere. It was on Saturday morning cartoons. It was sponsoring family programming. It was selling a ritual, like was Twist, Lick, Dunk, an interactive physical experience with a cookie that children performed and remembered and asked for by name at the grocery store. Hydrox, meanwhile, was marketing itself to adults on the basis of taste. Crunchier shell, less sweet filling. A cookie that didn't go soggy in milk the way Oreos did. Food writer Calvin Trillin called Hydrox the far superior cookie. The people who loved it fiercely. But the people who loved it were aging, and the next generation was growing up on Oreos, and preference formed in childhood is almost impossible to dislodge. There was also a quieter competitive battle happening at the retail level. The amount of shelf space a product receives in a grocery store is not random, it is negotiated, and companies with larger market shares and bigger promotional budgets consistently secure better placement. Products at eye level outsell products on the bottom shelf. Products with more facings, more copies of the same item visible side by side, outsell products with fewer. Nabisco had the leverage to negotiate prime real estate in cookie aisles across the country. Hydrox, increasingly found itself pushed aside, not dramatically, not all at once, but consistently enough that by the late 1990s, Leaf Brands would actually file a complaint with the FTC in 2018, alleging that Mondelez Oreo's parent company was actively hiding Hydrox products behind Oreo displays on store shelves. Whether intentional or structural, the effect was the same. Hydrox was getting harder to find, and products that are hard to find stop selling, and products that stop selling get discontinued. When Keebler acquired Sunshine in 1996, Hydrox was already generating only $16 million in annual sales against Oreo's $374 million. Keebler looked at those numbers and made a decision that was, from a pure business standpoint, completely rational. The Hydrox name was the problem. It sounded like a chemical. It evoked hydrogen peroxide, the brown bottle under your bathroom sink, not a dessert. So in 1999, they reformulated the cookie slightly and relaunched it under a new name, Droxy's. Keebler's marketing director for cookies, Carolyn Burns, explained the thinking to Fortune magazine at the time. The new name cued back to Hydrox, while sounding more fun and whimsical, better suited to the Keebler Elves brand imagery. The packaging got a blue color scheme, a milk waterfall, the Keebler Elf mascot front and center. Everything that Hydrox had never been, loud, cartoonish, aimed at children, was now plastered on the box. Consumers rejected it immediately. The people who bought Hydrox bought it specifically because it wasn't Oreo. They were adults who remembered what it tasted like as kids. They had strong opinions about the crunchier shell and the less sweet filling. They didn't want it rebranded with an elf on a milk waterfall. One fan, Gary Nadeau, wrote to the Wall Street Journal, "This is a dark time in cookie history, and for those of you who say, 'Get over it, it's only a cookie,' you have not lived until you have tasted a Hydrox." Droxy's lasted a few years before Kellogg's pulled it from the market entirely in 2003. In 2008, on the cookie's 100th anniversary, Kellogg's briefly brought back the original Hydrox name and packaging, a limited run that sold out quickly, which proved the demand was still there. Then let it disappear again less than a year later. The resurrection came in 2015. Elia Kassoff, CEO of a Newport Beach company called Leaf Brands, had been a lifelong Hydrox fan. He noticed that Kellogg's had allowed the Hydrox trademark to lapse under federal law. An abandoned trademark enters the public domain after 3 years of non-use. In 2014, he registered it for $275. In September 2015, Leaf Brands began manufacturing Hydrox again at a facility in Vernon, California, this time with the original style formula, using real cane sugar instead of high-fructose corn syrup, no artificial flavors, eventually earning non-GMO certification. The relaunch generated a wave of press coverage that finally, for the first time in over a century, told the full story. Hydrox was first. Oreo was the imitation. And Oreo had won anyway. Today, Hydrox is still on the market. Leaf Brands sells it online and through select grocery chains. It has a passionate, loyal following. It is objectively, measurably, a niche product in a market that Oreo commands, with roughly 10% of all cookie purchases in the United States. Mondelez, the conglomerate that now owns Oreo, controls nearly 40% of the entire American cookie market. Hydrox, the original, the blueprint, the cookie that Oreo was built on top of, is a specialty item you might find on Amazon or stumble across in a health food store. Being right about history, it turns out, has never once been enough to win a market. Chapter 9. The Building That Remained. When the last batch of cookies rolled off the line at Long Island City in 1965, nobody tore the building down. That might seem obvious in retrospect, but it wasn't guaranteed. Industrial structures of that scale, 1 million square feet, 10 stories, an entire city block, were expensive to maintain, difficult to repurpose, and often simply demolished when the original tenant left. The thousand-window bakery survived. And its survival over the next 60 years tells a story about what a city does with the things it can't quite bring itself to destroy. In the years following the factory's closure, the building passed through several hands and sat in various states of partial occupation. Office tenants moved in, light commercial uses spread across different floors. The building that had once been the center of American snack food production became just another large industrial shell in a Queens neighborhood, slowly losing its manufacturing identity. Long Island City in the 1960s and 70s was contracting. The factories were leaving, and nothing had arrived yet to fill the space they left behind. The thousand-window bakery sat in that in-between waiting. Then, in the early 1980s, someone had an ambitious idea. 3 adjacent buildings in the old Degnon terminal, the former Sunshine Factory, the Busilla building next door, and the American Chickle building across the way, would be transformed together into the International Design Center, New York, known as IDCNY. The concept was a high-end commercial hub for the interior design and architecture industry, modeled on trade centers in other major cities. The architecture firm IM Pei and Partners came in to handle the transformation for the Busilla building and the Chickle building. Pei's team opened up the interior courtyards and covered them with skylights, creating dramatic atriums flooded with natural light. The work on those 2 structures was striking, exactly the kind of bold, adaptive reuse that preservationists dream about. For the Sunshine Factory, now called Center 3, the interior renovation never happened. The stock market crash of 1987 hit commercial real estate hard. The IDCNY concept lost its financial footing, and the grand vision for the thousand-window bakery was quietly shelved. The building sat, partially used, its floors still largely intact from the baking era, waiting again. By the late 1990s, LaGuardia Community College had been operating in the Long Island City neighborhood since its founding in 1971, spread across a collection of converted factory buildings on Thompson Avenue. The college had been built from the beginning with a specific mission: open higher education to communities that had historically been locked out of it. Students from 160 countries speaking 127 languages. Many of them immigrants, first-generation college students, working adults trying to change the trajectory of their families. The school had grown steadily, and it needed space. In 2006, the New York State Legislature allocated $55 million for the college to acquire new campus buildings. And the Sunshine Biscuit Factory was the answer. The state purchased the building, and LaGuardia took it over, adding more than 70% to the size of the campus in a single transaction. They also acquired the adjacent 2-story garage, the same structure that had once stored the entire Sunshine delivery truck fleet, and folded it into the campus as well. The interior renovation began around 2006 and continued into the early 2010s. Classrooms were framed out, faculty offices were built, student services spaces, administrative departments, computer labs. The long open production floors that had once run continuous baking operations were subdivided and converted for entirely different kinds of work. During construction, workers encountered the past at every turn. A grain elevator from the Sunshine era, the kind of vertical conveyance system used to move bulk flour and sugar between floors of the factory, was removed during this phase. It was the last major piece of original industrial equipment still standing inside the building, When it came down, the last mechanical connection to the Sunshine Biscuit era went with it. But the floors told a different story. The 5th floor had housed Sunshine's sugar wafer department. The 6th floor was used for packaging. Both were laid with high-quality maple hardwood over a pine subfloor, material that nobody puts in a factory anymore. Built to last in an era when lasting was the standard. When a recent renovation project began transforming those 2 floors into a workforce development center, funded by a $116 million donation from the Stephen and Alexandra Cohen Foundation, workers started pulling up the old maple and found something unexpected. Dusty material was packed into the gaps between the planks, clumped and oddly textured. For a moment, one project manager thought it was a termite infestation. He crouched down and touched it. It was brown sugar, still there, pressed into the grain of the maple for 60 years, surviving every winter and every renovation cycle in between, outlasting the company that left it behind. The college donated the old wood rather than send it to a landfill. A wood salvaging company called M. Fine Lumber took 25,000 square feet of it. A local lighting company called Stick Bulb took 1,000 square feet and turned it into custom light fixtures for the renovation itself, meaning that pieces of the original Sunshine Biscuit Factory floor are now hanging as lamps inside the same building where workers once walked on them every day. Because the 15-foot planks were too large for the freight elevators, crews cut everything into 4x4 sections on each floor before moving it out. The building's history was being distributed to the neighborhood piece by piece, outside always. The facade that visitors see today is new, but only technically. By the time Mitchell Jurgala Architects was hired to address the exterior in 2013. Decades of neglect and inadequate patchwork repairs had caused the original terracotta cladding to fail in enough places that a protective sidewalk shed had surrounded the building for over a decade. Shielding pedestrians from falling debris while the college debated what to do, tear it down entirely? Replace the facade with something modern? The answer was neither. A new unitized terracotta curtain wall system was installed over the original structure. New material, new technology, but the same texture, the same color, the same geometry. The renovation was completed in 2018 and won the Chicago Athenaeum's American Architecture Award in 2024. The wedge shape at the corner of Thompson Avenue is the same. The hundreds of windows are the same. The rooftop billboard sign structure, which once carried the Loosewiles name and later the IDCNY branding, now reads LaGuardia Community College in illuminated letters. Today, roughly 60,000 students pass through this campus every year. Most of them have never heard of Sunshine Biscuits. They walk into the building thinking about their next exam or their next internship shift, completely unaware that the floor beneath their feet spent 60 years soaking up brown sugar in the largest bakery on earth. But the building remembers. The maple remembers. And somewhere in Queens, in a coffee shop or a studio lit by a stick bulb fixture made from century-old factory wood, a piece of the Sunshine Biscuit story is still glowing. Chapter 10. The Lessons. Let's take a step back and look at what actually happened here. Because the story of Sunshine Biscuits isn't just a nostalgia piece about cookies and a pretty building in Queens. It's a case study in how a company can do almost everything right at the beginning. The vision, the product innovation, the manufacturing design, the brand philosophy, and still end up on the wrong side of history. And the lessons buried inside that story are as relevant today as they were in 1902. Start with what Sunshine actually built. They were first to market with the chocolate sandwich cookie, Hydrox, in 1908. 4 years before Oreo existed. They were first to bring Cheez-It into national distribution, turning a small Dayton, Ohio cracker into one of the most recognized snack brands in the world. They designed manufacturing facilities around natural light and transparency at a time when the food industry was still hiding what it put inside its products. And they turned that design philosophy into a brand identity so strong that the name Sunshine carried genuine meaning to consumers for over 60 years. 3 legitimate, verifiable firsts, 3 innovations that shaped American snacking. And out of all of it, only one product line survived long enough to reach the shelves you shop at today. And it's making money for someone else. The first lesson is the one that should embarrass anyone who's ever launched a product without calling a lawyer first. Loose Wiles operated for 44 years without registering their own trademark. 44 years of building a name worth protecting, while leaving the door wide open for every competitor who wanted to slap the word Sunshine on their packaging and walk away clean. The legal battles that followed consumed resources, money management, attention, executive time, that could have gone toward marketing, distribution, or product development. By the time they finally locked down the Sunshine trademark in 1946, they had spent 4 decades fighting a problem that a single trademark filing in 1902 would have prevented entirely. No matter how good your product is, if you don't own your name, you don't own your brand. The second lesson is the one that stings the most because it runs directly counter to what most people believe about competition. Being first does not guarantee winning. Hydrox was first. Hydrox was, by multiple credible assessments, the better tasting cookie, crunchier shell, less sweet filling, didn't go soggy in milk, and had been kosher since day one, while Oreo used lard in its filling until the 1990s. None of that mattered. What mattered was that Nabisco had a larger advertising budget, a more aggressive distribution network, and a marketing team that turned eating a cookie into a physical ritual that children practiced and remembered and asked for by name at the grocery store. Hydrox marketed to adults on the basis of facts. Oreo marketed to children on the basis of feelings. Feelings won, they win almost every time. Being right about the product is necessary. It is not sufficient. The third lesson runs through every acquisition in this story, from American Tobacco in 1966 to Mars in 2024. Each time Sunshine changed hands, something was lost. Not immediately, and not all at once, but consistently, reliably, transaction by transaction, the portfolio shrank. American Tobacco had no strategic vision for a cookie company. GF Industries moved the headquarters to New Jersey and watched the brand drift. Keebler killed Hi-Ho, Chipperoos, Lemon Coolers, Golden Fruit, Golden Raisin, and Vienna Fingers. Decades-old products erased in months because they couldn't justify shelf space against better capitalized competitors. Kellogg kept what was commercially viable and retired the rest. What survived each round of cuts was Cheez-It, because Cheez-It was generating $125 million a year in 1996 and over $1.2 billion a year by 2022. A number too large to ignore, regardless of who owned it. The lesson isn't that acquisitions are always wrong. The lesson is that an independent company has a champion at the top who cares about the whole portfolio. Once that champion is gone, each brand has to justify its existence on its own, every quarter, forever. The fourth lesson is about physical presence and what it signals. When Sunshine closed the Long Island City factory in 1965, they weren't just making a logistics decision, they were walking off a stage. The 1,000-window bakery had been visible from the Queensboro Bridge for 50 years. It was a landmark, a symbol. The smell of cookies drifting across Queens every morning was the most effective ambient advertising campaign in the history of the company. And it cost nothing. The moment that building went dark, Sunshine lost a form of brand presence that no television spot could fully replace. Physical space tells a story about commitment, about permanence, about the belief that a company plans to be somewhere for a long time. When you leave, you stop telling that story, and here's where the full arc of this thing lands. Cheez-It, the product Sunshine acquired from a small Dayton cracker company in 1932, the product that survived every acquisition and every brand purge and every corporate restructuring of the past 90 years, is today generating over $1.2 billion in annual U.S. retail sales. In 2023, Kellogg's spun off its snack division, including Cheez-It, into a new publicly traded company called Kellanova. In August 2024, Mars Incorporated, the privately held candy and pet food giant behind M&M's, Snickers, and Pedigree, announced a deal to acquire Kellanova for approximately $36 billion, one of the largest food industry acquisitions in history. That deal closed in early 2025, which means the little orange cracker that Weston Green invented in Dayton, Ohio in 1921, that Sunshine brought to the nation, that Keebler inherited, that Kellogg's grew into a billion-dollar brand, is now owned by the same company that makes Snickers bars. The Sunshine name on the Cheez-It box is still there, but every dollar it generates goes to Mars. Jacob Luce died on March 16, 1923, at 72 years old. His wife Ella survived him by nearly a decade. Before she died, she donated 80 acres of land to the city of Kansas City to create a public park. It was named Luce Park, and it still carries that name today. A green, open space in the middle of a major American city, free to anyone who wants to walk through it. It's the one part of what Jacob Luce built that was never sold, never acquired, never restructured, never discontinued. A park doesn't have a quarterly earnings report. A park doesn't need to justify its shelf space. A park just stays. Everything else, the factories, the brands, the cookies, the crackers, pass through so many hands that the chain of ownership reads like a legal document. But the park remains. And somewhere in that contrast between the thing that was given away freely and the things that were sold and sold again until nothing recognizable was left, there might be the most honest lesson of all. The things built for people tend to outlast the things built for profit.